Good day. This is Module 1 Basic Concepts in Assessment. I hope that you are doing well because I really needed your ears and understanding for this topic or for this module because the topic that will be discussed here, the content that will be discussed here are very essential for you to understand the whole subject. No? We will be discussing here terms that are very necessary for you to understand the concepts of assessment and evaluation. So here are, for us to be directed, here are the learning outcomes of this module. At the end of the chapter, you should be able to define the terms assessment, evaluation, measurement, test, testing, formative assessment, placement assessment, diagnostic assessment, summative assessment, traditional assessment, portfolio assessment, and performance assessment. Second, discriminate the different purposes of assessment. Third, differentiate the different types of assessment. Fourth, identify and discuss the general principles of assessment. 5. Discuss the different guidelines for effective student assessment. And the last learning outcome is differentiate norm reference interpretation from criterion reference interpretation. For our introduction, assessment of learning focuses on the development and utilization of assessment tools to improve the teaching learning process. So again, if we're going to look at the definition of assessment of learning, it focuses on the development. That is why one of your outputs here for this subject is the development or the construction of assessment tools and utilization because you will be utilizing it, you will be using it, and then, of course, again, that developed and constructed assessment tools. The main reason why we have to utilize that for us to assess if there is an improvement or if there would be improvement on the teaching learning process. No? So again, assessment of learning focuses on the development and utilization of assessment tools to improve the teaching learning process. This assessment is not just to identify what are the things to be improved on the side of the students, but also to the side of the teacher also. No, so this is for the improvement, and then because of this assessment, the quality of instruction that will be given to the teachers will also be improved. It emphasizes on the use of testing for measuring the knowledge, comprehension, and other thinking skills of the students. We need to find out if the learners are actually learning as a result of teaching. So why do we have to assess probably? Why do we have to have assessment of learning? It is because we have to find out if the learners are actually learning as a result of teaching. Now, for us to tell if there is really learning, we have to look for a change of behavior. No, from bata na hindi marunong magbasa to marunong magbasa. Yung bata na hindi marunong mag-count 1 to 10, marunong nang mag-count 1 to 10. Yung bata na hindi marunong magsayaw because you teach that child or that kid how to dance, marunong na siyang magsayaw. Na that is change of behavior. So try to look at there is a change of behavior, therefore learners are actually learning. Now, the definition of assessment mentioned here, when we say assessment, it is a means of finding out what learning is taking place. So meaning to say, if we're going to look at the term assessment, the term assessment is very vague, that is very wide, that is very broad, no? Because it talks about the means, the methods of finding out what learning is taking place. Bakit sinabing what learning is taking place? Because we 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 should assure that we are not just teaching the students on the to develop their cognitive domain, but also to the other aspect, no, of learning, which is the affective and then of course the psychomotor domain of learning. There is a lot of debate about how to assess learning and especially about how to evaluate performance. Our objectives give us guidance on what to assess because they are written in terms of what the learners should be able to do. Based on these objectives, it is very useful to identify all the activities and skills which the learners will carry out, the conditions under which they will perform these tasks, and the activities, the possible results which might be obtained, and the standards by which their performance will be measured. The assessment itself can be done in different ways. So tingnan natin, let's try to look at the following questions. So you can have these questions, you can have this type of ways on how to assess your students. First one is you can do this one by assessing the performance of your students by asking ask the learner to recall facts or principles. For example, what is X? Okay, what is photosynthesis? What is 1987 Constitution? What is um, Bill of Rights, for example? Okay, so ask the learner to recall facts or principles. The second question is ask the learner to apply given or recalled facts or principles. For example, how does X help you solve this problem? Okay, so you are now applying. So the students, you ask the students to apply the given principle. Number three, ask the learner to select and apply facts and principles to solve a given problem. For example, what do you know that will help you solve this problem? Fourth one, ask the learner to formulate and solve his or her own problem by C by selecting, generating, and applying facts and principles. Example, what do I see as the as a problem here, and how can I reach a satisfying solution? Again, for number four, example, what do I do? What do I see as the problem here, and how can I reach a satisfying solution? Okay, and then the last question is ask the learner to perform tasks that shows mastery of the learning outcomes. So if we're going to look at here, the different questions or the five questions, you would notice the increase of level of difficulty. Okay, so meaning to say, these are the different ways for you to assess your students' learning. Once again, we need to stress the importance of participation, and this is especially important in assessment and evaluation. Learners should be actively involved in both the development of learning objectives and as much as possible in their own assessment. In many education systems, assessment is used as a tool for sorting students for selection process, for example, progression to higher level of education, higher rewards, among others. So, for example, um, um, during my elementary years, there is a so-called exam, no exam for you to jump off of a certain level. So, like for example, if you're a grade one, and then siguro one of your students or your advisor notice that your ability, mental ability is not for grade one. That is why probably your advisor, your teacher will recommend your parents to for you to take an exam, and that exam will be used for you to jump off to another year level that is appropriate to your mental capacity. Okay. Assessment, assessment where students are compared with each other is known as norm referencing. Again, if we are using assessment as a method of comparing students, we call it norm referencing. Assessment of learners in relation to a particular target or level of performance is called criterion referencing. Anyway, we will be discussing more norm referencing and criterion referencing later. Okay, here are now the different terminologies for assessment, testing, measurement, and evaluation. Assessment, measurement, and evaluation mean many different things. These terms are sometimes used interchangeably in the field of education. In this section, we shall point out the fundamental differences of the terms assessment, testing, measurement, and evaluation so that we will use them later appropriately. And during your exams, probably for your board examination, um, there would be definitions. So probably in your exam, um, ang question is all about a scenario, and then you are to identify kung saan siya appropriate, if it is assessment, testing, measurement, or evaluation. Let's try to look at these terms as interconnected. They are of course connected, but they have different meanings and purposes, and of course, um, nature. The term assessment refers to the different components and activities of different schools. So nakadepende kasi yan. Like for example, if the focus of the school is on arts, therefore the assessment is appropriate for arts. If the school is focusing on dancing or dance, for example, or music, for example, their assessment is all will be also be conformed to dancing and of course how to assess music, for example. No? If the school is for engineering, therefore they have their own nature of assessing the students for engineering, perhaps. An assessment can be used to student learning and in comparing student learning with the learning goals of an academic program. So marami tayong tinatawag, no? So ang assessment daw can be used for student learning, meaning for example, specific. An assessment, remember the term assessment, the assessment is a method or means, no, for us to find out kung ano yung learning na nangyari, no? So kung titingnan natin, the term assessment can be used to student. So for us to identify kung nag-progress ka ba or nag-decline ba yung knowledge mo about for this subject class or whatsoever. And also, assessment can be used in comparing student learning with your learning goals of an academic program. Like for example, the academic program is on BS Ed Sciences, and the comparison would be, assessment will be used if you are really for BS Ed Sciences, if you are really inclined to sciences, in science education, therefore you are really fit on that particular academic program. Assessment is defined as an act or process of collecting and interpreting information about student learning. Again, if we're going to look at assessment here, another definition of assessment is an act or process of collecting and interpreting information about student learning. So ang purpose dito, children, is to collect data, for example, and then interpret the information about the student learning. And then, of course, another way around, it is a systematic process of gathering, interpreting, and using this information about student learning. That is why if we're going to look at assessment really is very important. No, it can be used to student learning. And it emphasizes on individual student or groups of individuals and on the academic program of a certain educational institution. So it emphasizes on the individual student. So it can be used as ikaw, it can be used for the whole group, or it can be used in academic program of a certain educational institution. Like for example, bakit natin alam bakit ba may ranking of universities here in the Philippines? Why did they know about the performance? Like for example, it is because they give an assessment for those universities and then they rank them. So pwede talaga siya. So pwede siya for an individual student, pwede siya for the whole group. Like for example, meron kang CPE 105 na limang subjects, limang sections for example, and then you are to compare the groups. No, you're using assessment here. Now, there are different purposes of assessment, such as, of course, the first one is to provide feedback to students. This is the main point of assessing, and to serve as diagnostic tool for instruction. Remember here that when we talk about assessment of learning, it talks about it talks about on the development and utilization of assessment tools to improve the teaching learning process. Meaning to say, um, yung assessment is nasa gitna, and that it could affect students and of course it could affect teachers. Assessment here can give students feedback, and then they can assess themselves because of that feedback. And then it could also be used as a diagnostic tool for instruction. Like for example, if if the teaching is effective or not. No? So for this purpose, assessment usually answers the questions, was the instruction effective? No? If there is an increase or meron ka nakita increase sa performance right after assessing the performance of the students, you can now tell that really the instruction is effective. Right? And did the students achieve the intended learning outcomes? If you're going to look at the second bullet, it talks about the teaching learning process. It talks about the teacher and the students because that is the main point or the bottom line of assessment. Assessment is a general term that includes different ways that the teachers use to gather information in the classroom. We must remember that when we say assessment, it is a systematic or a scientific way of collecting and interpreting the gathered data. So that is the definition of assessment. The most common form of the most common form that is formed, the most common form of assessment is giving a test. Okay, so that is a test, and then you will know later that the term test here is very broad. The most common form of assessment is giving a test. Since test is a form of assessment, hence it also answers the question, how does individual student perform? Now we're going to look at again the definition of assessment is very broad. That is why sinulat natin kanina that assessment is a general term, no, that includes different ways that the teachers use to gather information. And one of the most common form of assessment is giving a test. Okay, so test also here is a big word, no? So since a test is a form of assessment, it also answers the question, how does individual student perform? So we can still assess now the performance of the students. Test is formal and systematic instrument, usually paper and pencil procedure kasi yan yung nasa sa mind natin. Okay, mag-test ba tayo ngayon? And then automatically yung magja-jump off sa mind natin would be a paper pencil test or procedure. So test is formal and systematic instrument, usually paper and pencil procedure, designed to assess the quality, ability, skill, or knowledge of the students by giving a set of questions in uniform manner. Like for example, multiple choice, yes. True or false, yes. Matching type, yes. Identification, for example. So that is your test. Again, that is a formal and systematic instrument. And then the purpose here is to assess the quality, ability, skill, or knowledge of the students. That is why test can answer the question, how does individual student perform? Now, we have here the term testing. Testing is one of the different methods used to measure the level of performance or achievement of the learners. So, ang sinabi natin dito, a test is one of the many types of assessment. Again, a test is one of the many types of assessment procedure used to gather information about the performance of the students. Okay, so ang test dito again, children, is also a procedure in gathering data, no? For us to know kung ano ba talaga yung performance ng estudyante. Now, the test with ing, the testing here, is one of the different methods used to measure the level of performance or achievement of the learners. Also, when we say testing, pag sinasabing testing, it also refers to the administration, ang pagbibigay, okay? That is testing, no? Ang pagbibigay ng question, no? The way you administer the test, that is part of the term testing. Scoring, what is the scoring procedure of your test? Like for example, 2 points ba yan? 3 points ba ito? So ano ba yung scoring procedure? That is part of what we call testing. No? An interpretation of the procedures designed to get information about the extent of the performance of the students, we call it testing. Okay. So, meaning to say, when we say assessment, assessment is a general term for us to gather information about the performance of the students. And one of the most common form of assessment is giving test. Okay? Is giving a test. So, yung test na sinasabi natin is it is a formal and systematic instrument yan. Instrument usually paper and pencil procedure. No, the purpose of test is to assess the quality, ability, skill, or knowledge of the students. And then when we say testing, the testing now is the procedure or the method. No, how you give the exam, the scoring procedure of your test, the interpretation of the result of your test. That is what we call testing. I hope that is very clear. Another. Okay, let's try to look at now the term measurement. So we are done with assessment, we are done with test, we are done with testing. Now, let's proceed to the term measurement. Measurement is a process of quantifying or assigning number. Again, please take note of the words quantifying or assigning number to the individual's intelligence, personality, attitudes, and values and achievement of the students. We are not just focusing here the mental capacity or capability of the students, but we are also including here the holistic part of the students, which is the personality, the attitudes and values and achievement of the students, and so forth. So again, when we say measurement, it talks about quantifying individuals' intelligence. Like for example, we say, before we'll proceed to another example now. Like for example, she's so intelligent. How intelligent is she? Ano ba? Yung IQ test ba niya is nalampasan ba niya kay Newton? So we have to have number so that we will know really kung gaano, no, the extent here. Okay, so express the assessment data in terms of numerical values and answer the question how much. Kanina ang question natin kanina would be how. How does individual student perform? Somewhat like that, no? Now the question now for measurement is how much? No, how much here? So examples, Renzel got 23 correct answers out of 25 items in mathematics. We are not judging here. We are just revealing the score of Renzel that according to the score, um, she got 23 correct answers out of 25 items. No? Shall we say ba na very intelligent siya? So we are not judging it yet. That is the purpose of measurement. The other example we have is Princess May got 95% in her English first grading periodic test. 95%. We are now giving a numerical value to the first grading periodic test of Princess May, but we don't know kung ano ba talaga ang interpretation of the 95% yet. Okay, so we're just giving it the numerical value. And then the last one we have is Ronix score 88% in his laboratory. Ronix score 88% in his laboratory test in biology. So what is now the difference between the number 88% and 95% for the subject English, for the subject biology and English respectively? Okay, so that is what we call measurement. Like for example, if we are having a test, a formative test, for example, a short quiz 1 to 10, for example, Piolo Pascual got 9 out of 10, 9 correct answers out of 10 items in mathematics test, for example. Okay, so again, we are just putting a value here. We are not yet judging kung ano ang quality of performance ni Piolo Pascual, for example, ni Renzel, Princess May Ronix, or ni Ronic. Okay, so again, we are not yet judging here. So again, in the examples that are given, numerical values are used to represent the performance of the students in different subjects. No? So numerical values again are used to represent the performance of the students in different subjects. Now, after collecting the assessment data, the teacher will use this to make decisions or judgment about the performance of the students in a certain instruction. So you now have the value, the number, comes from the word measurement there. So after collecting the assessment data, the teacher will use this to make decisions or judgment about the performance of the students in a certain instruction. Nandito na ang word na evaluation. Now, according to definition, evaluation refers to the process of judging the quality of what is good and what is desirable. So here is now the part wherein the teacher will now judge the quality, will now judge what is good and what is desirable given given the given with the assessment data, no? Given with the score of Renzel, given with the percentage that Princess May got for her English first periodic test, given that Ronick here got 88% in his laboratory test in biology. So this is now the time that we have to judge the 88%, the 95%, and then the 23 correct answers out of 25 items of Ronick, Princess May, and Renzel respectively. Okay, so this is now evaluation. It is a comparison of data to a set of standard or learning criteria for the purpose of judging the worth or quality. Example, in judging the quality of an essay written by the students about their opinion regarding the present state of the nation address of President Duterte, evaluation occurs after the assessment data has been collected. Okay, so again, evaluation occurs after the assessment data collected and synthesized because it is only in this time where a teacher is in the position to make judgment about the performance of the students. Meaning to say, sa, sa buong klase, for example, if the exam is 100 points, no, 100 points na siya, 100 points ang exam, 100 points ang exam, and then naay nakakuha dito og 50. And mingon din ka nga, okay, grabe, no? Ang bobo niyo talaga lahat. Like for example, ang bobo niyo, parang ganyan. And then you would notice na meron, the 50 pala here is the highest score. Okay? So meaning to say you are not there and there sa score pa lang, hindi natin kailangan i-judge, no? We have to collect first the data of the whole group, and then you have to look at the scores of everybody, and that's the time that you are to judge and evaluate the performance of the students. Baka kasi although 50 yung score niya out of 100, siya naman yung highest, so probably siya yung may mas mataas na grado or performance compared to the others. Okay. So that is evaluation. So for us really to identify, that is why in terms of evaluating your essay, dapat talaga meron tayong rubric na gagamitin. No? And this is now the time that we are to judge the content na dayon. Okay. So some of which would use rubrics or checklist for them to evaluate the output of the students. Okay. So here are the types of assessment procedures. So for the types of assessment procedures, we have, okay, classroom assessment procedures can be classified according to the nature of assessment, the format of assessment, use in the classroom instruction, and methods of interpreting the results according to Gronlund and Lean 2000. So first, we have to look at the first type of assessment procedure, the nature of assessment. Okay, so for the nature of assessment, we have two. We have the maximum performance and then the typical performance. So when we say maximum performance, according to definition, maximum performance, it is used to determine what individuals can do when performing at their best. Okay, so meaning to say pala, when we say maximum performance, how well a person performs in a particular field following instruction or teaching. Okay, then these are the qualities which are temporary and can be learned and developed over a period of time. So that is what we call maximum performance. So meaning to say there has to be a motivation. So kaya siya tinawag na maximum performance. And of course, the qualities presented in the maximum performance are all temporary and it can be learned, no? It can be learned right after instruction or teaching. So that is maximum performance. Example of your maximum performance, aptitude tests, and achievement tests. Okay. Now, when we say typical performance, kaya siya sinabing typical performance because this is the natural condition or the natural way. So according to definition, typical performance, it is used to determine what individuals will do under natural conditions. So meaning to say, this particular performance here, the nature of assessment doesn't need any motivation. For example, need not to be taught, sorry, need not to be taught, and of course need not to be to give some what you call this interventions for you to have this. No, when we say a typical performance, it is used to determine what individuals will do under natural conditions. So it includes assessments of personality, belief, values, and of course, interest. So if we're going to look at, it falls under natural conditions. Typical ways of thinking and behaving being referred to as underlying characteristics or traits, meaning to say, if we're going to look at the typical performance, looked into the underlying characteristics and traits of an individual. Okay, since we are talking about characteristics or traits here. Therefore, the traits are being mentioned are generally permanent in nature and an individual. So meaning to say, hindi siya natutuhan, but that is the innate of a person. So that is the difference between a maximum performance and typical performance. Most probably, para lang malaman natin, when we say maximum performance, it talks about assessment on ano ba, sa klase, for example. But sa typical performance, it's beyond sa classroom because it will measure the attitude of the student, the interest of the students, or personality, and so on. Okay, so that's the main idea and then the main differences of maximum performance and typical performance. I hope that is clear. Another types of assessment we have, or the classification assessment procedure, is the format of assessment. So we have two types of formats. We have fixed choice and then we have the complex performance assessment. Fixed choice test, no, na galing sa word na fixed choice, meaning to say meron na talagang pagpipilian. So an assessment used to measure knowledge and skills effectively and efficiently. So knowledge and skills po ito. And then standard multiple choice test is an example of an instrument used in fixed choice. A very good example for fixed choice test is the MCQ or the multiple choice test. It is because nandun na yung mga options. Another example siguro ng fixed choice, meron tayong, ano pa ba? The true false, probably. But the best way of describing fixed choice is the standard multiple choice. Another one is the complex performance assessment. Galing sa word na very complex, na very, the assessment or the format of the assessment is really complicated because it requires a complicated answer. So an assessment procedure used to measure the performance of the learner in contexts and on problems valued in their own right. So meaning to say, the perspective is in their own, the perspective that will be written on the assessment are on their own, no? So examples of instruments used in complex performance assessment, we have hands-on laboratory experiment, and then projects, essays, oral presentation. So those are the examples of your complex performance assessment. I hope that that is very clear, no, between fixed choice and then complex performance assessment for the format of assessment. Next is the role of assessment in classroom instruction. Okay, so this is now assessment being used in the classroom instruction. So let's try to look at that. Teaching and learning are reciprocal processes that depend on and affect one another. So if we're going to go back sa definition natin sa assessment of learning, it talks about the development and then the utilization of assessment or instrument or tools for us to look at the teaching and learning process. Because as we all know, we have the idea that learning is a two-way process. Learning must conform to must conform with the teachers, at the same time teachers the learning will also conform to the students. So we will learn from each other, and then there will be no learning if meron tayong mali on the other side. Okay, so that is according to Swearingen and Kelo, that teaching and learning are reciprocal processes that depend on and of course affect one another. The assessment component of the instructional processes deals with the learning progress of the students. Okay, so that is now the purpose of assessment on the side of the students and the teacher's effectiveness in imparting knowledge to the students, and because of that assessment, the teacher can know if the instruction is effective or not. No, right after teaching photosynthesis, you use a lecture type of delivering the instruction photosynthesis. Then right after an assessment, bagsak sila tanan, you reteach the subject or the lesson, and then you do the same, and then right after the assessment, all of the students still are failed, no, they bagsak din sila. That's the time that you will look at on the side of the teaching strategy that you are employing to your students. Meaning to say now, the assessment is a big part of the teaching and learning process, and we really have to look onto that. Assessment enhances learning in the instructional processes if the result provides feedbacks to both students and teachers. That is why really, if there are assessment na dapat talaga na ibalik sa estudyante agad-agad, and then they will be informed immediately, because the purpose of assessment is to provide feedbacks to our students, and it's, at the same time it could also give feedbacks to how we teach the lesson, or how are we as a teacher. Okay, that's the very essence of assessment. The information obtained from the assessment is used to evaluate the teaching methodologies and strategies of the teacher, and used to make teaching decisions, because this is now the time that we have to look into, no, if yan yung na-reveal right after series of assessment, that's the time that we have to decide kung ano ba talagang dapat natin gamitin. Okay. When planning assessment, it should start when teacher plans his instruction, when writing learning outcomes up to time when the teacher assesses the extent of achieving the learning outcome. So, ang assessment talaga nagsisimula yan by the time na nakita ni teacher kung ano yung learning outcomes, no? So dapat alam na yun ni teacher, no? Hanggang sa last part of the lesson. It is because probably the assessment will not just focus on on the last part of your lesson, but the assessment will we can say that assessment is very systematic, or by systematic, um systemic. Um, Again, systemic, no, when we say assessment is systemic, meaning to say it starts from the start of the lesson up to the last part of the lesson. So that should be the focus, kasi there are certain issues when we are delivering our lesson, when we are writing our lesson plan. It is because ang nafo-focus lang natin is writing the assessment on the last part of the lesson. And then the content should also conform to the assessment. Dapat yun yung lalabas. Okay? So systemic siyang kumbaga. Okay. So teachers made decisions from the beginning of instruction up to the end of instruction. There are four roles of assessment used in the instructional processes. Okay. The first one is the beginning of instruction. Okay. Again, there are four roles of assessment used in instructional processes. No, so the first is the beginning of instruction. For the beginning of instruction, we will be using the term placement assessment. According to definition, placement assessment according to Gronlund, Lin and Miller 2009 is concerned with the entry performance and typically focuses on the questions. If we're going to look at again, concerned with the entry performance and typically focuses on the questions, please take note. Does the learner possess the knowledge and skills needed to begin the planned instruction? Placement. So for example, if we're going to look at the question, we are probably dealing with the term pre-test here. Okay. Other question, to what extent has the learner already developed the understanding and skills that are goals of planned objectives? This is still the purpose of pre-test, no? So pre-test here is an example of placement assessment. And then the last question would be, to what extent do the students' interest, work habits, and personality indicate that one mode of instruction might be better than another? So, kung titingnan natin dito, the purpose pala of placement assessment is first to determine the prerequisite skills. So that is why we really have to give a placement assessment before the instruction meron tayong pa-exam. So ito ba yung sinasabi nating diagnostic? Probably, but the more emphasized type of assessment on the beginning of instruction is the so-called placement assessment. The purpose of which is to determine the prerequisite skills, because as we all know, our lesson, especially on the K-12 program, we all know that the topic are on spiraling, no, naka-spiraling siya, spiral approach yung approach ng curriculum, and then therefore we have to have prerequisite skills so that you can understand or you can grasp the next lesson. Uh, to determine the prerequisite skills, degree of mastery of the course objectives, and the best mode of learning. Okay, a very good example for placement assessment, readiness tests. That is one, no? Bibigay natin yung readiness test, hindi naman during the instruction, but before the instruction. Aptitude tests, yes, we can have that. Sino binibigay ang aptitude test para malaman talaga yung degree of mastery ng isang estudyante for that particular lesson. Baka kasi meron siyang prior knowledge. Pre-tests on course objectives. Yes, of course, the very famous pre-test. Self-report inventories. Okay, siguro meron kang, ano ba yan? Meron kang pa-interview siguro, no, beforehand. Other, of course, observational techniques. You can use that as your placement assessment. I hope that is very clear. Next we have is during instruction. So ano naman yung gagamitin natin na type of assessment during instruction? Kasi iba yan, and we really have to take note of this. During instruction, okay. So during the instructional process, the main concern of a classroom teacher is to monitor the learning progress of the students along the way. Ngayon yung concern natin. Teachers should assess whether students achieved the intended learning outcomes set for a particular lesson. So, dapat nating malaman that if that particular students really attain the learning outcomes of that particular lesson, they have to use this type of assessment during instruction. Okay? The teacher should provide a feedback to reinforce learning. This one, the famous feature or the notified or the noted feature of the assessment belongs to the during instruction, no, sa ating assessment is the feedback, no, because most of the feedbacks during instruction assessment are immediate feedback, and they are very essential for the learning and of course in reinforcing the learning of the students. According to Garnison and Erringhurst 2007, stressed in their paper formative and summative assessment in the classroom that feedback provides students with an understanding of what they are doing well, links to the classroom learning, and gives specific input on how to reach the next step in learning progression. That is why really feedback is very important because this is now the time that malalaman nila, okay, that we are really ready for the next level. And also, this is also good for the teachers on the side of the teachers that um, the teachers could give the idea that, okay, I can move on to the next lesson, or okay, I can give something to the students because somewhat and somehow they have difficulty grasping the lesson, for example. Okay, so the first example, or um, the first type of assessment falls under during instruction is the formative assessment. So the formative assessment is a type of assessment used to monitor the learning progress of the students during instruction. That is why if you could still remember during your elementary years, perhaps, or during your high school years, na yung teacher ninyo, they are asking you to get one-fourth sheet of paper right after the teacher discussed the lesson. One-fourth sheet of paper, and then meron siyang pa-multiple choice perhaps na ang items 1 to 10. Get one-fourth sheet of paper and number your paper 1 to 10. Okay. So that is a type of a formative assessment. Now, the importance of that, of course, is the purposes of the formative assessment are the following. The first one is to provide immediate feedback. Now, the term there is immediate feedback to both student and teacher regarding the success and failures of learning. Because right after discussing a certain topic, and then you would notice that most or 75% or 90% of your students uh, failed sa tinatawag nating formative assessment, meaning to say the instruction or the way you teach the subject or the lesson is not effective. And this is now the time that you have to reteach the lesson on the other way around. Next is to identify the learning errors that need correction because along the way, because of the fast, siguro kay paspas kayo ang discussion, no, because kailangan nato ma-attain gyud ang isa ka oras na lesson. That is why dili kay nato ma-retain sa to ang mind kung ano yung na-discuss ni teacher, for example. So it could give you some misconceptions, and these misconceptions can be corrected right after because the feedback is immediate. Letter C, to provide teachers with information on how to modify the instruction. Yes, the main goal of assessment again here is to identify if that particular instruction is effective or not. Okay, so if you would notice that most of the students failed the formative assessment, that is now the time that you have to decide for your instruction or for your way of teaching. And then letter D, the last one is to improve the learning and instruction. So that is actually the bottom part or the bottom purpose or the main purpose of assessment. This is to improve learning and instruction. The next type of assessment falls under during instruction is the diagnostic assessment. If we're going to look at the term diagnostic, you would notice that probably it is not intended for the during instruction. So if we were to classify that, you would think that diagnostic assessment is part of the before instruction, but it is probably not, and probably yes. No? So when we say diagnostic assessment, it is a type of assessment given at the beginning of instruction or during instruction. And that is really true that really diagnostic is for the beginning of instruction and of course during instruction. Why? It aims to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the students regarding the topics to be discussed. So kailangan nating malaman yung strength and weaknesses of the students. Probably we will be talking about here the prerequisite skills. And for you to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the students regarding the topics to be discussed, you have to use the diagnostic assessment before or the beginning of the instruction. Yeah? And then the purposes of diagnostic assessment are to determine the level of competence of the students. Yes. And then letter B, to identify the students who already have knowledge about the lesson. We have to really look into that because para naman ma-adjust natin yung assessment natin, no? And then the way how we deliver the lesson para ma-adjust natin. The third one is to determine the causes of learning problems that cannot be revealed by formative assessment. Kasi nga, during the formative assessment, the feedback is immediate, no? The feedback is immediate, and then what I mean is that the action or the response to the students are immediate because that is right after the discussion, no, formative assessment. Therefore, malilimit natin yung what you call this factors or reasons why they got 100% na score, for example, or they got failed, for example. So, malilimit natin. But if we really have to look into the wide range of learning problems, we can use diagnostic assessment. I um, would like to emphasize here that diagnostic assessment is probably hindi naman siya overlapping, but titingnan lang natin yung purpose or yung aim ng or nature ng diagnostic assessment. So it can be partnered with the formative assessment for the jury instruction in such a way that there are things that cannot be revealed by formative assessment. If we wanted to have wide range, if we have to have an info about the causes of learning problems, we have to use diagnostic assessment. And the last one is to formulate a plan for remedial action. No, kasi nga right after doing diagnostic assessment, nakita mo yung mas klarong causes of learning problems, and that's the time that you can create a remedial action. Okay? So if you can still remember, meron tayong pa-remedial no during our elementary years or our high school years, for example. Okay, so that is our diagnostic assessment. Please take note that this is the assessment given at the beginning of instruction because we have to look into the level of competence of the students, the strengths and weaknesses of the students regarding sa topic to be discussed. No, that is why it should be given at the beginning of instruction. The during instruction naman is para siyang type of a formative assessment, but the purpose here is to know more about the causes of the learning problems, no? Na hindi nakikita ng formative assessment. And of course, the main goal is for us to formulate a remedial action. Next we have is the end of instruction, and this is a part of what we call, this is end of instruction, and we call it the summative assessment. So when we say summative assessment, it is a type of assessment usually given at the end of a course or unit. Now, the purposes of assessment are first, of course, to determine the extent to which the instructional objectives have been met. Ang purpose talaga ng summative assessment dito is kung na-achieve ba natin or na-meet ba natin yung lahat ng instructional objectives given for that course or unit. Now, that's the main purpose. Like for example, we have for this particular subject, our prelim, the coverage of prelim will be up starting from the basic terms or terminologies in assessment up to rubrics. All of the instructional objectives starting from the basic terms in assessment up to rubrics, no? Gagawa natin yan ng exam, and that would be part of the summative assessment. So the purpose of this prelim now is to determine the extent to which the instructional objectives from Module 1 to Module 5 have been met. And then, of course, to certify student mastery of the intended learning outcomes, as well as use it for assigning grades, of course, because remember that your exam is part of the components of your grade, one of the components of your grade, and then to provide information for judging appropriateness of the instructional objectives, and the last one is to determine the effectiveness of instruction. Very good example of your summative test. Of course, we have a teacher-made survey test, performance rating scales, and then product scales. So that is for summative test. It is because kaya nasabi ditong product scales, it is because one of the summative, siguro meron talaga mga summative assessment that they are not into paper and pencil type of test. Siguro yung iba meron talagang gagawin na project, for example. That's why we have to have product skills. And some of which hindi kailangan ng exam, no? Hindi kailangan ng survey test, no? Teacher-made survey test dito. Kasi yung iba, for example, sa physical education na na subject, siguro dapat may sayaw na mabubuo, for example, and that is still part of what we call performance rating skills. Also for the if you are majoring in English and theater and arts, probably your summative or your periodic exam would be more on theater, for example. So that is why nilagay dito na performance rating skills. And before I forget, siguro I would like to give you the examples of your diagnostic assessment. Sa diagnostic assessment, we have published diagnostic tests. When we say published diagnostic tests, sila po yung mga tinatawag siguro natin mga standardized na test. Teacher-made diagnostic tests, and of course, is the very important one, observational techniques. Next would be the methods of interpreting the results. So I think this is the last types of assessment procedure, the methods of interpreting the results. We also have here two. The first one is norm reference interpretation, and it talks, and the second one would be the criterion reference interpretation. Now, what's the difference between the two? When we say norm reference interpretation, it is used to describe student performance according to relative position in some known group. So like for example, sa klase ninyo, merong right after siguro ng exam or whatsoever assessment, and then sabi ni teacher, okay, Mark ranks or Fernando ranks fifth in a classroom group of 40. So ibig sabihin, ikalima, panglima si Fernando sa 40 students, for example. Okay? And then we also have on the other section siguro, um, Fernando ranks first in a classroom group of 20. Parang ganyan. Okay? So, if we're going to look at the two examples, meron yang differences, no, in terms of magnitude, no. So anyway, that is what we call the norm reference interpretation. That the performance of the students will be compared to the group, no. So in this method of interpretation, it is assumed that the level of performance of students will not vary much from one class to another class. So that is the interpretation, no? So comparison to any group. The other type of the methods of interpreting the result we have is the criterion reference interpretation. By the way, very good example of norm reference interpretation would be the standardized aptitude and achievement tests, yes, and then teacher-made survey tests. Anyway, the term survey will be discussed that because it is not a survey like a survey, no? And then interest inventories, and then adjustment inventories. Okay, so that is the norm reference interpretation. As you can see, um, the result of this test can be of course interpreted to the whole group kung sino talaga yung mas magaling. So that is norm reference. Another method we have is the criterion reference interpretation. So it is used naman to describe students' performance according to it is used to describe student performance according to a specified domain of clearly defined learning task. Um, example would be divide three-digit whole numbers correctly and accurately, or multiply binomial terms correctly, or recite the lyrics of the Philippine national anthem uh, accurately and correctly. Okay, so if we're going to look at here, the interpretation now of the assessment or the performance would be based on the criteria or the criterion given by the teacher. So the performance will not be compared to other group or to the whole group, but the comparison here or the basis of the interpretation will be more on the criterion. No, so this method of interpretation is used when the teacher wants to determine how well the students have learned specific knowledge or skills in a certain course or subject matter. Pag gusto talaga ni teacher makita kung ano ba talaga yung alam niyo of that particular um, for that particular lesson, for example, ito yung tinatawag natin na criterion reference interpretation. So again, this method of interpretation is used when the teacher wants to determine how well the students have learned specific knowledge. Okay? Kasi nga, if we're going to look at here the learning task have learning objectives and that are very specific. Okay? So yun yung purpose ni teacher. If the teacher really wanted to know kung gaano niya kung gaano ni estudyante alam mag-divide ng three-digit whole numbers correctly and accurately. So it is based on the criterion. Okay. Other types of tests. Okay, let's proceed to other types. Other types of descriptive terms used to describe tests in contrasting types such as the non-standardized versus standardized test, objective versus subjective tests, supply versus fixed response tests, individual versus group tests, mastery versus survey tests, speed versus power tests. So let's try to look at first non-standardized test versus standardized test. So the main difference between the two is that non-standardized tests, they are developed or constructed by the teachers, classroom teachers. Okay, and then the standardized tests, they are developed by the test specialists, and then it is administered, scored, and interpreted using a certain standard condition. Okay, and then of course malalaman talaga they are really standard. It is because yung 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 test, they are subjected into different corrections and reliability and validity and so on. Okay, so that is why naging standardized test siya. So that is the main differences between non-standardized and standardized test. Next, the objective test versus subjective test. Objective test is a type of test in which two or more evaluators give an examinee the same score. It is because on the side of the objective test, meron talagang isang tamang sagot. Okay? Sa subjective test naman, it is a type of test in which the scores are influenced by the judgment of the evaluators. Kaya siya tinawag na subjective test. Meaning, there is no one correct answer. Very good example for objective test is for the objective test, very good example is is the multiple choice test. If we're going to look at kahit sino yung mag-check ng paper ninyo, the same pa rin yung scoring procedure. It is because there is one definite answer lang. Okay? So that is for the objective test. But for the subjective test, for example, essay. Okay. For example, merong question of what is love? And then love here can be defined and can be relayed in different angles, no, in different perspective. Therefore, then the answer or the evaluation or the judgment of the evaluators kay laylay po siya. Kay wala may sakto or wala may isa right answer. Okay? And because these subjective tests are really subjected saan siya, to the judgment of the evaluators, although meron tayong judgment of evaluators, and it could become bias on the side of the student siguro, kaya meron pa rin tayong tinatawag na rubrics and checklist. Okay? And then on my part, and for you all, if you will be if you will be given and kung magbibigay kayo ng test, for example, an essay question to your students, please tell them that every time they will give you the paper, dapat siguro nakatupi yung mga pangalan nila na hindi mo makikita, or siguro yung ano ba, yung pangalan nila will be written on the last part na ng paragraph para naman malimit natin yung tinatawag natin na biases. Kasi nga, hindi talaga makakaligtaan if you will be reading an essay and alam mo na si ito ay si Portolano, for example, and Portolano is very intelligent, siya yung rank 1 ninyo, ay definitely ang nagpapasok talaga sa ating isipan would be okay, the essay is so nice, the essay is very substantial and so on. So it will the mind will be your mind will be dictated with those facts, and the way you are judging now the essay will not be the same with the other people. So that is why I would suggest and recommend that dapat yung pangalan hindi nakikita if they would be submitting you an essay para malimit natin or ma-minimize natin yung tinatawag natin na biases or self-judgment. Anyway, so that is the main difference of objective test and subjective test. Again, for objective test, may isang sagot, may isang tamang sagot, but for the subjective test, walang isang tamang sagot. Okay? Since walang isang tamang sagot, the answer here or the scores will be influenced by the judgment of the evaluators. And to minimize and to limit the biases, we have to have a rubric or a checklist. Okay, next type of test we have is the supply test versus the fixed response test. This is very sabotable with the term supply and fixed, but the nature is very complicated, no, nakakalito, very confusing. Let's try to look at supply test and fixed response test. When we say supply test, it is a type of test that requires the examinees to supply an answer, such as an essay test item or completion or short answer test item. So lahat ng mga sinusulatan, for example, na walang definite answer, that is what we call supply test. Okay. And the other one is the fixed response test is a type of test that requires the examinees to select an answer from a given option, such as multiple choice test, matching type of test, or true false test. So meaning to say, ang titingnan lang natin una, dapat meron choices given. Okay, and that is what we call fixed response test. If the test doesn't have any options, and then you have to supply it with whatsoever, and that is now the supply test. Okay, so that is the difference, the main difference between the supply test and then of course the fixed response test. The other type of test we have is individual test versus group test. This is very understandable and sabotable. When we say individual test, this is administered to student on a one-on-one basis. Example is oral questioning. Okay, so that is individual test. For example, okay, tomorrow we'll be having an oral recitation. So for that oral recitation, you are giving a test to the student on a one-on-one basis. And then of course, since that is on one-on-one basis, the grading also is individual on one-on-one basis. Nakadepende kung ano yung sagot niya. Okay? On the other hand, the group test here, a type of test administered to a group of individuals or group of students. Group of tests, siguro, very good example would be a group work. Okay? A group work or the exam mismo. Okay? Yung exam, periodical exam and so on. Okay? So administered to a group of individuals or group of students. So that is the difference between individual test and then the group test. The next type of test we have is the mastery test versus survey test. So ito yung sinasabi natin na mention kanina na example, no, yung teacher-made survey test. So when we say mastery and survey test, when we say mastery, it is a type of achievement test that measures the degree of mastery of a limited set of learning outcomes using criterion reference to interpret result. Let's just run through the definition. No? When we say survey test, it is a type of test that measures students' general achievement over a broad range of learning outcomes using norm reference to interpret the result. Now, the first main difference between the two is yung method of interpreting the results. No? Mastery test uses criterion reference to interpret the result, while survey test uses norm reference to interpret the result. So what is now the type of the exam then? When we say mastery test, it focuses on a certain criteria given by the teacher. So like for example, ano ba? Yung lesson is all about balancing chemical equation. Now, sa mastery test, the mastery test would be, the exam would be more on the balancing chemical equation. Okay? And then, of course, the interpretation now of the results of the performance will be based on dapat alam ng estudyante mag-balance ng chemical equation. On the other hand, for the survey test naman, yung survey test, siguro ang example ng survey test natin dito would be in the form of summative test, no? That the method of interpreting the result is the norm reference or the whole group. Okay? So sa survey test, siguro, summative test, for example, achievement test, yung mga periodical test, those are probably the examples of your survey test. And again, if you are to look at survey test is a type of test that measures students' general achievement. General achievement siya over a broad, re- uh, broad range of learning outcomes, no? Using norm reference to interpret the result. Okay, so that is the main differences of mastery test and survey test. Last last types of the last type of test we have is the speed test versus power test. Napakaklaro sa mga terminong ginamit. We have speed and power. Sa speed test na tinatawag natin, gumagamit po tayo ng time dito, no? So sa speed test, in a speed test, there is a time limit within which the test taker is required to answer all the items. Okay. So dapat meron siyang, for example, okay, time pressure na exam, you will be given a minute to solve the problems, and that is speed test, no? And on the other hand, when we say power test assesses the underlying ability of the individuals by allowing them sufficient time. These tests do not have any time limit. So ang purpose naman dito is dapat makita talaga yung ability ng estudyante of that particular test. So since gusto nating malaman yung underlying ability of the individuals or yung estudyante natin, we will be giving them sufficient time. Okay? And then it is designed to measure the level of performance rather than speed of response. It contains test items that are arranged according to increasing degree of difficulty. So that is now the format of the power test. So those are the other types of tests. I hope that that is very clear to you. So we will now proceed to the modes of assessment. No? I think this is the last topic for this module. Yes, the modes of assessment. There are different types of modes of assessment used by a classroom teacher to assess the learning progress of the students. These are traditional assessment, alternative assessment, performance-based assessment, and portfolio assessment. Let's try to look at especially the last two mentioned. It is because probably you could think that the last two type of assessment mentioned are being part of the other and so on. So let's try to look at. The first one is traditional assessment. So according to the definition, traditional assessment is a type of assessment in which the students choose their answer from a given list of choices. In traditional assessment, students are expected to recognize that there is only one correct answer or best answer for the question asked. So ito yung tinatawag natin na traditional assessment, which is the very famous no nung sinauna before the advent of the so-called the K to 12 and then the so-called performance based and so on, we have this traditional assessment. So according to this daw, this is a type of assessment in which yung mga estudyante ay dapat silang pipili ng mga choices or dapat silang pipili ng sagot given given on the list of choices. So merong pagpipilian, no? And that is a traditional assessment. So, and then of course, it is expected, no, it is expected in traditional assessment that we really have to recognize that there is only one correct answer or best answer for the question asked, and that is traditional assessment. Okay. On the other hand, I hope that is very clear. So, very good examples of your traditional assessment, of course, your multiple choice test. Meron ka dong list of choices, tama, and then isa lang yung tamang sagot. For standard true false test, when we say standard true false test, ito yung the typical standard false test kasi meron tayong modified true false test, no? So this is the common or the typical true false test. Isa lang ang tamang sagot. It's either the true or the false. And then sa matching type naman, this is actually another form of multiple choice, no? But you have to match it up, no? If you're going to look at meron siyang list of choices and there is only one correct answer or best answer. And then of course another example we have is the fill in the blank test. Sa fill in the blank test, siguro meron kang isang box and then sa box nandun yung pagpipilian. Okay? So there is on each item, meron lang isang tamang sagot, the best correct answer, and you have the list of choices. So that is the feature of your traditional assessment. If you're to look at traditional assessment, it is more on objective type of test, no? But this is on the other one. Okay? So this is mode of assessment, traditional, very general. The other mode of assessment we have is the alternative assessment. Okay. Students create an original response to answer a certain question. Students respond to a question using their own ideas in their own words. So this is now the different, um, the main difference between the traditional and alternative. Kasi pag titingnan natin yung traditional assessment, that is a type of assessment wherein meron talagang tamang sagot. And then, since meron talagang tamang sagot, meron ding pagpipilian. Okay? That is traditional assessment. On the other hand, we have alternative assessment. There is no uh, there is no only one answer, correct answer. So probably there are a lot of answers nakadepende yan. Okay? And for them to create an answer, they have to create their own answer. They have to create their original responses to a certain question. So students respond to a question using their own ideas in their own words. So wala talagang tamang, there is no correct answer. There is no only one correct answer or there is no only one best answer. Okay, so this is for the alternative assessment when it comes to Kwan. Okay, and then the very good examples of alternative assessment, we have short answer questions. No? For example, um, define photosynthesis. Okay, so define. There is no exact way, really, verbatim on how to define photosynthesis or what is love or what is beauty, something like that. And for essays, of course, they have to create their original response. Oral presentations, that is impromptu, like what I am doing now. This is oral presentation. So this is if you are the teacher, you are now assessing me. This is a type of this is an alternative assessment. No? Okay. And then exhibitions, we have demonstrations, performance assessment, and portfolios, teacher observation, and student self-assessment. So this is for the alternative assessment. Now we have the components of alternative assessment. The first one, assessment, is based on authentic task. When we say authentic, original, no? Authentic task, that original, legit, and so on. That demonstrates students' ability to accomplish communication skills. The teacher and students focus on communication, not on right and wrong answers. Okay, so the common goal here is on communication, not the right and wrong answers. This is for the alternative assessment. Students help the teacher to set the criteria for successful completion of communication tasks. Okay, and then the last one would be students have opportunities to assess themselves and their peers. Okay. Students have opportunities to assess themselves and, of course, their peers. This is the nice thing of the alternative assessment because if we're going to look at, no, probably your alternative assessment is a democratic, very democratic type of assessment compared to the traditional one. The next one is the performance-based assessment. Students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills. And you would like to look at that. I think performance-based assessment is an example of alternative assessment, and that is okay. Again, when we say performance-based assessment, students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills. This is according to Miller 2010. It is a direct measure of student performance. It is because the tasks are designed to incorporate context, problems, and solution strategies that students would use in real life. It focuses on processes and rationales. There is no single correct answer. Instead, the students are led to craft polished, thorough, and justifiable responses, performances, and products. The teacher here, the role of the teacher now is not just a facilitator, but I think a very important part is a collaborator. Collaborator in creating tasks, such as well as in developing guidelines for scoring and interpretation. And of course, in this kind of assessment, no, in this kind of assessment, it involves long-range projects, exhibits, and performances that are linked to the curriculum. That is why really communication to our teachers are very important. Labeled our teacher here as a collaborator, not not really as a teacher, but a collaborator. Next mode of assessment we have is the portfolio assessment. According to Ferenc K 2001, portfolio assessment is the systematic, longitudinal collection of student work created in response to specific, known instructional objectives and evaluated in relation to the same criteria. Portfolio, as you know, no, and we are very familiar with the term portfolio. Portfolio here is a purposeful collection. It is a collection of student work that exhibits the students' efforts, progress, and achievements in one or more areas over a period of time. So meaning to say, ang gagawin dito sa portfolio would just be a collection. Tinawag siyang purposeful. It is because along the way we can say that there is right after siguro we can say that there is an improvement for that students. So that is why portfolio is very important because as part of the estudyante siguro we could say na okay I did an improvement, for example. Okay, so that is portfolio. Next we have is the contextualized assessment. So the focus is on the student's construction of functioning knowledge and the student's performance in application of knowledge in the real work context of the discipline area. So pag sinasabing contextualization assessment, um, yung nakabase siya kung ano yung pwede sa'yo, kung ano yung present, no? That is contextual. So the focus is on the student's construction of functioning knowledge. Okay. It uses performance-based tasks which are authentic in nature. It measures skills and knowledge in dealing with specific situations or performs specific tasks which the students have identified as important and meaningful to them. Application of the skills and knowledge must be in the context of the real world as possible. Okay. If we're going to look at I think titingnan natin kung meron pa ba. Okay. We still have the contextualize and I will synthesize for the modes of assessment. The contextualized assessment, it includes written exams and term papers which are suitable for assessing declarative knowledge. Okay, so that is our decontextualize. Okay. Next we have is do not necessarily have a direct connection to a real life context because ang gagawin na natin dito would be to assess the declarative knowledge, the basic knowledge. No, okay. It focuses on declarative knowledge and our procedural knowledge in artificial situations detached from the real work context. If we're going to look at contextualized assessment and the contextualized assessment, the main difference the main difference of the two assessment is the authentic tasks, no? The task being authentic, no? Sa tinatawag nating contextualized assessment, we are dealing with real-life problems. Since these are real-life problems, we have to construct real-life solutions also. But on the contextualized assessment, it is more on the declarative knowledge, no? To just assess the declarative knowledge. So ano yung declarative knowledge? These are procedural knowledge in artificial situations, and it doesn't necessarily mean the real work context. Okay, so that is the contextualized assessment. Again, the main differences between contextualized and decontextualized is the authenticity of the tasks. No, okay. Now, if we're going to look at now the assessment, except for the traditional assessment, the rest of the modes of assessment, they are dealing with real life problems. No, they are they are very suitable to this 21st century. No, why do we have to emphasize these things? Because in every institution, ang gusto talaga na ma-produce nating graduates would be students that are holistic, no? That they are not just intelligent in some way. They are not just intelligent when it comes to lessons, when it comes to their field of specializations, but also to the intelligent siguro pagdating sa buhay, no? Being wise and being initiative, resourceful, those are very important in the real world compared really to a very intellectual man, no? So meaning to say that um, the affective domain here, and then the affective domain, or the attitude, and then of course the intelligence, or the IQ, sorry, the IQ and the EQ here should marry, no? Dapat mag-marry talaga sila. So the role of assessment in learning, let's try to look at. Assessment is used for various purposes: assessment for learning, assessment as learning, assessment of learning. So for assessment for learning, where assessment helps teachers gain insight into what students understand in order to plan and guide instruction and provide helpful feedback to the students. So where assessment helps teachers, this is now on the perspective of the teacher, no? Gain insight into what students understand in order to plan. That is assessment for learning. When we say assessment as learning, where students develop an awareness of how they learn, this is now the side of the students, and use the awareness to adjust and advance their learning. But when we say assessment of learning, it is where assessment informs students, teachers, and parents, as well as the broader educational community, of the achievement at a certain point in time in order to celebrate success, plan interventions, and support continued progress. And we're going to look at children, the three roles of assessment here. You would notice na meron silang iba't ibang focus, no? Sa assessment for learning, it focuses more on the teachers to students. For assessment as learning, focuses more on the students, on how to improve the learning of the students, no, awareness of the students. On the side of the assessment of learning, focuses on the whole, no, sa students, sa teachers, and parents. So that is assessment, no, for learning, assessment as learning, assessment of learning. Okay. The preposition for in assessment for learning implies that assessment is done to improve and ensure learning. So that is for the assessment learning additional info. This is referred to as formative assessment. Assessment that is given while the teacher is in the process of student formation. So it ensures that learning is going on while teacher is in the process of teaching. That is what we call assessment for learning. When we say assessment as learning is associated with self-assessment. As the term implies, assessment by itself is already a form of learning for the students. That is why if we're going to look at assessment as learning, it is on the perspective of the students. Okay, that is self-assessment. On the other side, when we say assessment of learning is usually given at the end of a unit, grading period, or a term like a semester. It is meant to assess learning for grading purposes, thus the term assessment of learning. Okay, so it is referred to as summative assessment. The effectiveness of summative assessment depends on the validity and reliability of the assessment activity tools. That is why really, if we're trying to go back, the role of assessment in learning has its own focus, no? Has its own focus, and of course has its own purpose. So those are the three: assessment for learning, assessment as learning, assessment of learning. Now, here are the guidelines for effective student assessment. Let's just run through everything. According to Gronlund 1998, provided the general guidelines for using student assessment effectively. Effective assessment requires a clear concept of all intended learning outcomes. Dapat talaga, alam talaga, yung learning outcomes talaga yung backbone natin for us to really incorporate an effective assessment or appropriate assessment. Effective assessment requires that a variety of assessment procedures should be used. Hindi lang po dapat isa. Okay? Because along the way, if we're going to look at marami tayong tinatawag na multiple intelligences, and we have to know really the cause of the learning problems. That is why variety of assessment procedures should be used. Effective assessment requires that the instructional relevance of the procedure should be considered. Okay? Effective assessment requires an adequate sample of student performance. Fifth, effective assessment requires that the procedure must be fair to everyone. Of course, hindi pwedeng merong pinapaboran, right? Okay. Sixth, effective assessment requires specifications of criteria for judging successful performance. That is why still we really have to look into our learning outcomes. Effective performance requires feedback to students emphasizing strengths of performance and weaknesses to be corrected. This is the ano ba yan? Tinatawag nating purpose of the assessment, of course, no, to correct what is kung misconceptions or things to be corrected. And then the last one, effective assessment must be supported by comprehensive grading and reporting system. And this is part of the this should be notified by the teachers, no? Dapat alam ng estudyante sa una pa lang kung ano yung grading system and reporting system ng ng teacher of that particular subject. I hope those are very clear, and that is the end of module 1. Thank you so much for listening. If there are things that are not so clear to you, you can just go back to the discussion and then listen again, listen, no? And then if you really have questions, you may ask me, no? Of course, I am just a PM away. You just have to message me. Thank you so much, and this is again the end of Module 1. Thank you for listening.